Okay, so this presentation will focus on the worker responses that I've observed as we conducted research on Amazon's warehouses in the US. And so it comes from a larger project in which we had this question in which we were trying to understand Amazon's policing practices through the experiences of its majority Black workforce. In this project, we looked at one particular warehouse in the US South in Alabama, and we're very happy that this research has just actually a couple of days ago been published in Work and Occupations. So what we did there is what we found there is that workers talked about the conditions at this warehouse in the sense that we call it a militarization of employment relations. So the workers we talked to talked about being intensively surveilled and observed constantly, also talked about being subjected to public and private policing, as well as being under a sort of almost plantation style management. So taken together, these three kind of dimensions, that's how cumulatively we say that is a type of militarization of employment relations. And as a result, this comes to a amplified way essentially of labor control with an impact especially felt for these Black workers. So a heavily racialized impact in which workers talked about feeling intimidated, criminalized, and enslaved. So as we conducted this research, looking at the worker experiences, at the same time, we also saw, of course, workers responding to these working conditions, to that type of labor regime, and responding collectively in different ways. And so what we're going to present here is preliminary work that looks at the variance essentially in collective worker responses, whether it's through trade unions, worker centers, independent unions, and kind of what we think might explain that. And again, this is very preliminary, so any type of comment or feedback would be very appreciated. So for this, we looked more specifically at four warehouses across the US in Minnesota, New York, North Carolina, and Alabama. And this is part of a larger kind of team effort. This presentation is based on our qualitative work, which we did a lot of interviews and also spent time at these sites, and especially our former graduate students spent quite a bit of time in Alabama, in Bessemer, and in North Carolina, in Garner. And just to give a very brief overview of these warehouses, so we have, for example, BHM1 in Alabama, that is where we see the presence of a traditional union working alongside the workers. In North Carolina, you have an independent union, so workers started CAUS, Carolina Amazonians United for Solidarity and Empowerment. At JFK 8, we have, of course, ALU now with the Teamsters. And then in Minnesota, we have the presence of a worker center, a Wood, with its large Somali workforce there. For this presentation, we'll focus on BHM1 and RDU1. So let's briefly start with setting the context. And Tammy and I always do this as a part of our work. We think it's important to historically contextualize our setting and understanding where we're at. So when we think of Bessemer, Alabama, and where Amazon located there. So this opened in 2020. It's in a majority Black community with high rates of poverty. It's a very large fulfillment center. And so Amazon immediately also became the largest employer in town. It's located very close to former plantations, and we also see, when we think of Alabama, it's also, again, important to think about the historical legacies, essentially, and memory of anti-racist struggles that happened there, as well as of white supremacist terror by police, local companies, and vigilantes. The union context in Alabama is statewide. It's about 6% unionization. There is a history of union organizing. And while it's lower than the national average in the US, it's still significant, essentially, for the Deep South. So what many people already are familiar with, of course, is that since 2021, workers in Bessemer, Alabama, with the support of this traditional union, the RWDSU, have been engaged in these ongoing campaigns to win a union election. Currently, there is the result of the second election that has still been undecided, essentially. So what did we see in terms of responses? So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of union strategies, community strategies, and very briefly pointing out the challenges before Tammy takes over to the next case. So in terms of union strategies, we saw clear kind of the typical kind of rhetoric as well from the unions, and rightly so, talking to the workers that say, this is your campaign, we are not here as outsiders, but you are the union, right? That worker participation element was felt very strongly. By the way, these are all, these kind of initial observations come from our field notes sitting in these various meetings over time. It was also shown by unions and organizers the kind of collective power that workers needed to build, especially within the facility. For example, going in the facility, wearing red shirts with the union logo on. A lot of the some of the white organizers also really pointed out that there's no kind of need to be threatened. You are protected. We have union lawyers. We have the NLRB here that can protect you. And there's also those university people here, and that was us, as a way to kind of almost legitimizing or validating what they were doing and making sure that they felt protected in a way. We also saw that the unions came in with resources. So workers had access to resources. So they were organizers, local as well as national organizers on the ground. Workers were able to meet either in a union hall or in a hotel close to the warehouse. But then there are also tensions, for example, along racial lines. For example, we saw when we were there on the ground, there was a clear moment in which white organizers did not listen to some of the discomforts of Black leaders. And in this case, this was a case in which the union wanted to drive up to and drive onto the parking lot of the warehouse, which is private property. Whereas one of the Black organizers said, like, no, we shouldn't do that. You know, there was a fear that the police might come and it could escalate, etc. But white organizers kind of dismissed that fear and said, we should do it anyway. And he was essentially overruled. So at the same time, we also saw a big element of one of the main community organizations on the ground was the Jobs to Move America. We were actually put in touch with them through CWO, Rutgers Center for Innovative Worker Organization, rather than through the union. But here, when talking with people from JMA, it was very clear that JMA's job was to engage in this political education with the community. And they were saying things like, you know, this campaign can stop, or union organizers can go back to where they come from, for example, New York, but Amazon is here, it's going to stay, and it's in our community, and people from the community need to know about that impact and how companies should be accountable for the actions that they do. Some of the strategies were also quite interesting. For example, they were saying that, you know, people from the community might spend hours at a barbershop or at a hairstylist, and, you know, we might as well be there and talk to them about unions. So there were kind of two arms that we saw from that campaign. But we also saw some challenges in terms of also, and worker responses, that workers that were quite disappointed and felt exhausted about kind of the long process. They were disappointed with the union because of these perceived failures from the NLRB to protect them. And here, it's again, especially also talking with some of the Black workers, they were saying things like, the state has never really been there to protect us, so why would we have thought differently now? And so we saw some of these tensions happening. And then also the two arms that I mentioned before, community and union, weren't always very much connected. So many workers we talked to didn't really know about Jobs to Move America. And so that was another challenge within that kind of collective response that we noticed. So I'll give it over to Tammy to talk about
Yeah,
the Garner.
Maite,
Yeah.
if you don't mind, can you go back to slide 13? There's just something I wanted to mention about JMA and Bessemer. Yeah, so that first bullet point I think is kind of important when we think about worker responses before I tell you what went down in North Carolina. You see there that JMA is hinting at something that I think will end up being important, but again, we're really early in this research. But JMA, which is an outside nonprofit community organization, who is doing organizing of the community that is the family of the Black workers that work at Amazon, right? And what JMA is saying is, well, the union's just giving them education on the union and the NLRB process. And then those folks go home and they are having to be with their families who say, why are you trying to organize Amazon? You're going to shut down the only employer in town, right? So it almost gets undone if you don't also organize the community around the workers who are hearing from the union that, oh, the NLRB and all these things can protect you, right? So I think that's kind of important. I think it might be important in the end. But okay, Maite, you can go ahead to Garner. So it's a similar context, right? Garner, North Carolina is also in the southern United States. Also, Amazon is definitely employing disproportionately amount of Black workers. We also know here, let me get to that slide, that in North Carolina, particularly during the pandemic and even after the pandemic, we have unemployment rates for Black workers that are twice that of white workers. And it's a very, very, very anti-union state, maybe even more so than Alabama. And for those reasons, we saw that there were a lot of sort of Black liberation groups, right, that were working in this space. And in fact, we put here on the slide that North Carolina had one of the first Black worker centers as a response to how anti-union and sort of some legacies of racism in the state. Next slide, Maite. So so what happened in Garner was that the workers, two in particular, I talk about Mom Mary all the time. These are two older Black workers. One of them is a pastor, Rev Ryan. The other one is an older Black woman. And they were the first ones to kind of think about we should, put this union together. Um, and Maite told you that the name is Carolina Amazonians United for Solidarity and Empowerment. Why did they form? Again, we're looking at worker response to the way Amazon militarizes its employment relations. So it was responding, or the workers were responding to the same conditions that we saw in Alabama. But in addition to that, and this is where our intersectional lens becomes important, um, Amazon has special relationship with the state where they employ disabled workers and they kind of get a kickback from the state. So there's an intersectional lens here where Black disabled workers are working at Amazon and Garner, and then Amazon's failing to accommodate them. So what happened to start this campaign is that a worker died at Garner, and Amazon didn't say anything to the workers. They just were like, oh my God, our colleague died. And so the kind of organizing that Cause was getting into was then taking these individual complaints about disability, about racism, et cetera, and posting them on Twitter as a collective, like, right, with very radical language. You can advance, Maite, because we're running out of time. We have 2 minutes. So, these are some really key quotes that we saw from workers about why they're organizing. But let's just go over to the second one, for example, because I think that's important. Listen to the tone of the language, right? Only the economic oppressed can receive liberating visions in wretched places such as the Amazon plantation. We must organize with a sense of urgency. Our worker-led movement is not only about our economic justice, but for future generations, power to all workers. They're radicals, right? They are thinking about and they're watching RWDSU. They're also watching ALU. They idolize Chris Smalls as a Black civil rights leader, right? They were looking at him, oh, this Black man won this union. This is amazing. They have questions about RWDSU, right? They're not sold on the fact that the union can understand Black liberation, and so they don't know if they want to affiliate into an established union. Um, there's some other really important stuff here, but we're running out of time, Maite. Yeah, and one more. Uh, yeah. So, um, why an independent union versus going the route of like getting an established union, right? And it's because there's this really deep. The people who are leading it have more political education coming from these Black liberation organizations and community organizations than the folks in Alabama were getting, which they were getting directly from a traditional trade union, which had a lot of white organizers, and something was lacking in that model that North Carolina wants to stay independent. Next slide, Maite. So maybe I'll wrap it up here since we're on 0 minutes. But this is one of the young organizers. It may be that generation becomes an important intersection as well. But this young organizer says, listen, unions are very willing to help us. They're talking about RWDSU, Teamsters, all those folks. And we have been in discussions with them. But we are looking for unions who can aid us financially with organizers and training without full affiliation, right? They're saying we want to organize. The labor movement's talking about they want this one big tent, they want to help us, but we don't want to have to affiliate in order to get access to lawyers to fight Amazon, right? This is very expensive. We need a place to meet. Can we meet at the union hall? And the unions were responding with, this is only reserved for those people who pay dues to us, right? We're the exclusive representative, so you have to pay dues to get access to all of these resources. So some of the questions that might come out of this and some of the implications are, what do we need to be thinking about as a broad labor movement about how we're going to meet the needs of the type of organizing that is going on across all these different warehouses, right? Especially when they're led by Black folks, immigrant folks who have specific needs in terms of bigger liberation.